Hello, class. This is week 4. And for week 4, you are to be reading an article by Matthews and Hubbards, a chapter out of a book. And it really gets you thinking about the question of how much do societal issues, economic issues, cultural issues influence the way we view the role of men and women in the family and in the church. Now, while that is a good question, that chapter doesn't really get into the issue of complementarianism and egalitarianism, which is what we want to address in this little lecture. So let me first point out that Ephesians 5:23 through 25 says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So the question is, what does it mean that the husband is the head of the wife? Now, complementarianism would say this: husbands and wives have been made with equal value in the image of God, but have been assigned distinct yet complementary hierarchical roles. In other words, complementarianism would say that the term head means that he has loving authority in the family, in the marriage, and in the church. Egalitarianism, on the other hand, would say husbands and wives have been made with equal value in the image of God, so far identical, but have not been assigned distinct hierarchical roles. And they would take the meaning of head not to be a concept of authority or having any hierarchy. It's more the idea of loving, nurturing. So there's no authority involved in the word head. So what I want to do is, and with a lot of theological issues, it all boils down to hermeneutics. It all boils down to how do you interpret the text. And I want to give you 7 interpretive principles. Now, I would land in the complementarian camp, but let me say this. I think even if you land in the complementarian camp, you have to be careful that you don't, as the article said, read too much cultural baggage into how that should be. So some people who are complementarians have a very strict, very rule-oriented view of how everybody must live out headship. And I would say, while we could agree on the idea that there is a head, how that is worked out could look very different from family to family and from church to church. Now, my interpretive principles amazingly all rhyme. So let me give you the first one. Prescription interprets description. What this means is when you're reading the Bible, there are some prescriptions, in other words, commands, and a lot of the Bible, though, is just description. Jesus went here, David did this, Moses did this. And a prescription is a command, but a description isn't necessarily a command. So we need to interpret descriptive passages, historical passages, in light of clear prescriptive passages. So an example I like to give is when Philip baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but Philip disappears after he baptizes him. Now, if you take that description as prescription, then the only valid way to baptize people is in an open pond, and the baptizer must disappear. But that's ridiculous. And I think that's an extreme example to show us that turning every descriptive passage into a prescriptive passage can be dangerous. Now, let me give you some examples. David had many wives, but we know that's just description. Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 19 that when God intended marriage, he created a man and a woman. It is to be one man, one woman for life. Deborah was a judge in the Old Testament. Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos. Now, you can conclude a lot about those passages, but realize both of them are descriptive passages, not necessarily prescriptive passages. So what I would encourage us to do is say, where are the passages that clearly teach on gender roles? And I would identify Ephesians 5 as a key passage, 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 14 on roles in the church, and 1 Corinthians 11. In fact, I would add 1 Corinthians 14 also. The next principle, direct attention interprets indirect mention. In other words, when trying to figure out a theological issue, you want to first ask, are there passages that directly teach on the topic, or do they just kind of tangentially mention them? You want to give more weight to the passages that directly teach. So, for example, let's say you were having trouble with your car brakes and you open your car owner's manual. There's an entire chapter devoted to the brakes. But you decide, instead of reading it, to go to the index and kind of do a word study on every time the word brakes appears, and you build your theology of brakes on all the tangential passages. No, the smart thing to do would be to read the chapter devoted to brakes. A great example on this is justification. Galatians and Romans actually directly teach on the topic of justification. Now, you want to be careful then that you don't build your view of justification, for example, on the parable of the sheep and the goats, where you might think that your salvation is based on your works, but when you look at what Paul teaches on justification, you see that you are justified by faith, and the fruit of that faith will be works, but they're not the basis of your justification. So again, what passages directly deal with headship issues? Ephesians 5, 1 Timothy 2, 1 Corinthians 11, throw in chapter 14 also. Number 3, role assignments are not value alignments. Every time this issue gets raised, the sticking point for a lot of people is this. They assume that somebody put in a authoritative role, a hierarchical role, that if they're in that role, that means they are better than, that there's a value judgment going on here. And I would just say that is not necessarily true. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul says, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." So here you have the husband over the wife, Christ over the man, and God the Father over Christ. We can't conclude that there's a value judgment being based on this hierarchy, because the Father and the Son, while distinct in role, and even there's hierarchy and submission, they are of equal value. And if that is true, then I think we can also conclude that there's equal value between the head in the family. Number 4, because a truth can be abused doesn't mean it should be refused. What this is saying is, yes, it is true that men have abused the headship in the family and in the church. There are many examples of this. But is the solution to refuse these passages on headship, or should we be aware that any truth can be abused? Let me go on to number 5. Because a truth is hard to apply doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So it does get very difficult in trying to figure out, what does it mean that the husband is the head of the family or in the church? What does it mean that men are the ones to have authority and to do the teaching? What about a woman teaching youth group? is, well, she's not supposed to teach men, but when does a person become a man? And do you draw that at junior high or in high school or in college? And I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer. But does that mean because there are difficult applications, we should abandon them? No. Number 6, be careful that a one another doesn't equalize child and mother. Um, Ephesians 5:21 is appealed to a lot of times to say there can be no hierarchy. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, here's what you do. Then it says, wives, submit to your own husbands. Now, what the egalitarian position would say is whatever verse 22 means, that the wife, if she's to submit to the husband, verse 21 means that the husband is also to submit to the wife. So 22 can't be the only kind of submission going on. Well, I think there's a problem in that when we consistently apply that through the rest of the passage, for example, the thought flows into chapter 6. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Well, if you apply the same logic of verse 21 to Ephesians 6, you should conclude that parents are to submit to children, right? And then slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Well, should the masters submit to their slaves? And to get real ridiculous, you could say if verse 21 neutralizes any hierarchy, then slaves should submit to other people's wives and masters to children and husbands to slaves and wives to masters and masters to husbands. It's just total chaos. Here's what I think Paul is doing. He's saying, here's the principle. God's a God of order. Submit to one another, and here's how you submit. Wives to husbands, children to parents, slaves to masters. Finally, is there something on the page that makes this text for every age? Not every prescription is for all time. A clear example of that would be when Paul says, greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, what's for all time is be kind and greet one another. But there's nothing about the kiss that makes that for all time. You could substitute greet one another with a holy handshake or a holy hug. But when it comes to these passages on roles, we have to ask, is there something on the page that makes the text for every age? 1 Corinthians 11, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, the head of Christ is God. The fact that this hierarchy goes all the way up into the Trinity means we can't just dismiss the hierarchy as cultural. The same would be true of 1 Timothy 2. I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she's to remain quiet. And again, volumes have been written on what that means and what it doesn't mean. But all I want us to see is that Paul's prohibition here is not based on some cultural thing in first century Ephesus. He takes us back to the Garden of Eden. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. That's an argument from creation primacy. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. And boy, is that controversial. But all I want us to see is that however you apply verse 12, it has to be consistent over all time, because Paul takes us back to the garden. Finally, in Ephesians 5, I'll just point out that the pattern of headship and submission is based on the church submitting to Christ. Once again, that transcends culture. So it's hard to just quickly dismiss this passage. So, a lot to think about in a short amount of time. There's an overview of some hermeneutics that go into thinking through this issue.